Before we talk about what isn't there, we need to talk about what was. Picture a quiet Sunday morning on August 16th, 1942, in Daly City, California. On Bellevue Avenue, a man is standing in his driveway, meticulously waxing his black 1928 Dodge sedan. It's the kind of peaceful, mundane morning that shouldn't make history. Then, the sky begins to sag. Out of the dissipating fog comes a 147-foot-long Navy airship, the L-8. It isn't flying, it's dragging. It scrapes across the rooftops of the 400 block, snapping telephone lines and grazing power lines before the gondola finally thuds onto the pavement, coming to rest, tilted against a telephone pole. A volunteer fireman who lived just doors away didn't wait for orders. He ran to the door, expecting to pull bloodied men from a wreck. He found the door latched open, but as he stepped inside, the only sound was the low, steady idle of the engines. The radio was on and fully functional. A crewman's hat was resting casually on the controls. There were sandwiches on the table and coffee that was still warm to the touch. Everything suggested that Lieutenant Ernest Cody and Ensign Charles Adams were right there, just out of sight. But they were gone. 82 years later, the chair is still empty. We often want to blame pilot error for mysteries like this, but Cody and Adams weren't amateurs. 27-year-old Lieutenant Cody was a 1938 Naval Academy graduate, described by his commander as one of the most capable pilots and able officers under his command. His partner, 35-year-old Ensign Charles Adams, was a legend in the lighter-than-air community. He had 20 years of experience with over 2,200 hours of flight time. He had served aboard the great airships Los Angeles, Akron, and Macon, and had even been decorated by the German government for his bravery in rescuing survivors during the Hindenburg disaster in 1937. The L-8 itself was no fragile prototype. Originally a Goodyear advertising blimp, it had been requisitioned by the Navy after Pearl Harbor. It was a workhorse, with 1,092 successful trips under its belt, and had been inspected just 4 days prior. It had even earned a place in history by delivering critical parts for the B-25 bombers used in the legendary Doolittle raid. Here's a detail that often gets lost. There were supposed to be 3 men on that flight, but at the last second, the Navy realized the payload, including 2 325-pound depth charges, was 200 pounds overweight. They bumped the 3rd man. He stood on the deck of Treasure Island at 6:03 a.m. and watched his friends float away into a fog that for them would never lift. The flight was a routine anti-submarine patrol, scheduled for 4 hours. At 7:38 a.m., the routine ended. Cody radioed.
Spotted suspicious oil slick, 4 miles east of the Farallons, investigating.
Near the islands, 2 ships, the Liberty ship SS Albert Gallatin and the fishing trawler Daisy Gray, watched the blimp work. This is where the human element gets visceral. The first mate on the Daisy Gray was so close, he could distinguish the color of the pilot's hair. He watched them drop 2 white smoke flares to mark the spot. He watched them hover just 30 feet above the waves, so low the sailors feared a depth charge was about to be dropped. Everything looked professional, controlled, but at 9 a.m., the L-8 simply left. It rose, dropped its ballast, and began a silent drift back toward San Francisco. From that moment on, the radio stayed dead. No distress call, no goodbye, just a lingering silence over the Pacific. This is where the timeline fractures. At 10:49 a.m., a Pan American Clipper pilot reported seeing the blimp over the Golden Gate Bridge. It looked fine. It appeared to be under control and heading home. But just 10 minutes later, at 11 a.m., a Kingfisher float plane spotted at 15 miles southwest of the bridge, rising through the clouds at 2,000 feet. Let's do the math. To move 15 miles in 10 minutes, that blimp would have to be doing nearly 100 miles per hour. Its top speed was 60, unless the L-8 found a jet stream that didn't exist. It shouldn't have been able to make that jump. And then there are the witnesses on the ground. A 17-year-old boy and a woman on horseback near the beach both claimed they saw figures moving inside the gondola as it drifted. The woman stated she was quite sure she saw at least 3 men inside. The Navy insists the men were already gone, but the people who actually looked through binoculars that day were quite sure of what they saw. If the crew was gone, who or what was moving around in that cabin? The end came at 11:15 a.m. A lone swimmer at Ocean Beach saw the blimp emerge from the fog, sagging and motors silent. It bounced off the sand and careened into an embankment, dislodging one of its 325-pound depth charges. Free from that weight, the blimp surged back into the sky. It floated over the Olympic Club golf course, where golfers watched in horror as a live bomb rolled past them down the green. When the L-8 finally settled on Bellevue Avenue, the scene was eerie. The propellers on the starboard engine were bent, but the engine was still idling. The radio was functional. The parachutes were still on their hooks. 2 life jackets were missing, which was expected for a crew flying over water, but their life raft was still in the cabin. They didn't jump. They didn't crash. They just ceased to be. If you're following us down this rabbit hole, take a moment to subscribe to the Nightshift Chronicles and hit that notification bell. We're diving deep into the archives of military anomalies, and your support is what keeps these investigations alive. Now, think about the evidence we've covered so far. Was it a freak accident, or was it a tactical escape? Drop a comment below with your initial theory before we look at what the Navy found when they finally opened that door. The Navy's official conclusion is a masterpiece of bureaucratic frustration. On August 18th, a spokesman admitted to the press that while the Navy was positive the men weren't on board during the land flight, they were still completely in the dark. He put it this way:
"The Navy knows of no satisfactory explanation for what happened, nor has any explanation ever been found."
They tried to sell the door latch theory, that one man fell out while inspecting the oil slick and the other fell trying to save him. But these were veteran sailors in calm seas. If they fell, why didn't they radio for help? And why, despite a massive search of 132,000 square miles, did we never find a single trace of them? Then there's the fuel. The L-8 started with 12 hours of fuel and landed with 4. Somewhere in those missing hours, someone intentionally dumped over 30% of the fuel. That's not an accident. That's a desperate move to gain altitude fast. And the briefcase? Locked in the cabin was a file of secret codes and classified documents. To a man like Cody, losing those was a court-martial offense. He wouldn't have left them behind unless he was physically taken from that ship. We have to consider the context of 1942. Japanese and German naval forces were conducting attacks near the U.S. mainland. Just 10 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor, a Japanese I-class submarine surfaced and sank the SS Cynthia Olsen. Japanese records show the submarine commander provided rations to the surviving Americans in their lifeboats, yet none of the 35 crew members were ever seen again. Could Cody and Adams have been captured? If they spotted a submarine and descended to investigate, were they taken prisoner? But if they were, who flew the blimp back to the Golden Gate Bridge? The military investigated every angle, from a lover's triangle to spying but found zero evidence. No struggle, no blood, just an empty, humming gondola. Maybe the answer isn't in the mechanical logs. Maybe it's in the location. The area near the Farallon Islands is known as the Devil's Teeth. It's a place that seems to swallow experts. In 2007, Jim Gray, one of the world's most brilliant computer scientists, sailed toward those same islands on a clear, calm day. He vanished. No wreckage, no emergency beacon, no explanation. 3 years after the L-8, the 5 bombers of Flight 19 disappeared after reporting that the ocean didn't look right. Is it possible there was electromagnetic interference or a dimensional slippage? It would explain the radio silence despite a working radio. It would explain the impossible speed. It's as if the L-8 entered a space where our rules of physics no longer applied, and when it came back, it forgot to bring its passengers. The Ghost Blimp isn't just a wartime anomaly, it's a message, a reminder that we are only ever one routine flight away from the inexplicable. The Navy declared Cody and Adams dead a year later, but their story remains a black hole in the official record. But the L-8 isn't the only time the military has watched its people vanish and then pulled the curtain shut. To understand what's really happening, we have to look back to 1918, to the Phantom pilots. Before radar, before digital tracking, men were vanishing under circumstances that make the L-8 look like a simple misunderstanding. What are they so willing to lose people to keep secret? Find out in our next video. Stay awake, stay curious.